One of the things I've become really fascinated by is how information has been lost, how history's lost. Maritime is a language, and New York City was once fluent in it and has now lost it.
How do we keep alive the memory of a working waterfront? There was a time when the waterfront was our front yard. Transportation was the waterways. And as we moved away from that, maybe we could say we turned our backs a little bit, or we've cast our eyes away from the waterfront.
Something happens in the city where the city forgets its own waterfront history, really.
There's all kinds of efforts to get us back. The importance of the waterfront is immense, as is its potential is immense. The challenges are just as immense.
So when you think about the history of the working waterfront, or just the waterfront in general in New York City, I think first it's important to ground yourself in the knowledge that the city is here, and it became a thriving city because of New York Harbor and because of its waterfront.
New York, since its founding, has always been a port city. And that port grew. There were a number of major catalysts that helped that port expand and eventually become, the busiest or one of the busiest in the world at different points in time. You have the construction of the Erie Canal. New York City is officially the end point of the Erie Canal. All of a sudden, having this be kind of the outport for all of the agricultural production of the Midwest had a huge impact on the expansion of the port of New York City.
And there could be thousands of boats here coming and going. And in the winter, they would tie up here. So this would be a floating community, adding to the community of longshoremen and other folks who are working here. So it was very bustling, a lot of activity.
New York City also grew because of the port to become a major manufacturing city. So we're producing goods here in New York City because we are bringing in raw materials from around the world, and then we can export goods all around the world that are manufactured here as well. So you can't talk about the history of New York City without talking about the port.
So it was a constant flow of people coming in ships, plus the people working on the ships. So there were all sorts of businesses related to shipping, but also related to the kind of things sailors would need, like food and drink, clothing, things like that.
The predominant system of shipping was what's called break bulk cargo, which still exists. Cargo would arrive, it would be in nets, it would be in sacks, and you would need a whole army of dock workers or longshoremen to basically break it up.
All of that started changing when the changes and shifts in transportation and commerce came about.
What began to happen over time is the rise of trucking, right? So if you look at early trucks in the 1930s, they kind of look a little bit janky. They may not look like the future of shipping, but eventually rail, and not just commuter rail, but freight rail begins to decline. There's a lot of disinvestment because it takes a lot of work to maintain. Shipping is still happening, but we're turning away from ferries. We're turning away from the waterfront. The automobile is ascendant, and the maritime operations of the Brooklyn waterfront, they kind of peak during World War II. And then that level of activity is not seen again. And the shot heard around the world is the invention of containerization.
So I would argue that the shipping container is the most important invention of the 20th century. It's completely transformed global trade. And it was basically created here in the Port of New York.
It's not just, we're taking the break bulk cargo and we're putting it in a 20-foot or 40-foot box. What containerization really is the seamless transfer of that box via a huge crane from a ship or from a concrete yard and onto the bed of a truck.
But it took 30 years for containerization to totally take over. It was a long transition period.
The first commercially successful containerized shipment was on April 26, 1956. That was like 50 something containers. Like, we regularly have ships that call in the Port of New York that carry 15,000. So you've seen this exponential increase in the size. So it's this revolutionary technology that vastly increases the efficiency and reduces the friction of shipping, because you don't have all these people shifting stuff all the time back and forth between different modes of transportation. So from an efficiency standpoint, it's great. From a labor standpoint, it became extremely complicated because, again, all of a sudden it's a massively labor-saving technology. So when we talk about the abandonment of the waterfront, we need to talk about the infrastructure as well as the people.
Gone are the literally hundreds, thousands of tugs and barges that would have shifted goods, and the hundreds of thousands of men that would spend all a week loading a barge like this with bags and barrels and bundles of rice and wheat and flour and sugar and spices, and go across the river under the power of a tug to be docked to only do the same thing again. Tremendous amount of labor to load and unload these barges.
So when we talk about the people, you have literally tens of thousands of longshoremen that forced out of work, and you have a lot of labor unrest where they're trying to basically negotiate how this industry is going to continue.
Containerization, in many ways, rendered not only break bulk cargo obsolete, it rendered the Brooklyn waterfront obsolete. Finger piers were designed to accommodate these skinny ocean liners and break bulk cargo. But in order to have that kind of modernized container port, you need a lot of upland space. And that's something New York City has never had, right? And so almost overnight, really, shipping moves from its historic home in what was called South Brooklyn, which is really Brooklyn Heights, Red Hook, portions of Sunset Park, to New Jersey, Port Newark, Port Elizabeth, where they have the space to build those new modern facilities to accommodate all those cranes, all those stacked containers, all the trucks that have to go back and forth. There were attempts to foster kind of a smaller container port in New York City. So the New York Dock Company at that time was kind of the biggest waterfront property owner in the world. And in the 1950s, they went bankrupt. They were sold. And eventually, their properties were acquired by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And the Port Authority demolished hundreds of finger piers from Greenpoint to Red Hook, and they built 13 large square piers that today are Brooklyn Bridge Park, the Brooklyn Cruise Terminal, and the Red Hook Container Terminal. And so that was kind of how they attempted to, sort of revitalize shipping east of Hudson.
And at that point, not much happens in Atlantic Basin. It sort of sits idle. There are various attempts. The Port Authority does have various plans to do things in the area. It was a grand plan to take over large portions of the waterfront from Red Hook down to what's now the Columbia Waterfront District. And they did succeed in tearing down lots of buildings and displacing lots of people, but then the plan didn't come to fruition as large as they envisioned it. It left a lot of area which had been housing decimated, and then a waterfront not fully activated. Maybe because there's conflict of interest, because they're also running the ports in New Jersey, and those are doing quite well. So that now they'd be stealing from themselves to help Brooklyn, and perhaps that's why there's not as much effort to get the jobs and the ships back here.
And so you come to a point in the 1970s where, a lot of these efforts have failed because they can't compete with New Jersey. New York City was in decline. The city was going bankrupt. Part of the reason the city was going, or the way that the city dealt with its bankruptcy, is to attempt to balance its fiscal budget by raiding its capital budget. And so there was no money to maintain much of the waterfront. So in many ways, if you look at a map of Brooklyn in the 1970s, you see all these designated urban renewal areas where the city just didn't have the money or the know-how or really the desire to retain industry. And the problem is that at that very same moment, there were waves of immigrants arriving in New York City, right? Puerto Rican immigrants, Dominican immigrants. And at the time that those people were looking for working class jobs, those jobs were disappearing. It was really quite catastrophic.
And so when the jobs disappear, people leave certain neighborhoods. So neighborhoods that used to be known as longshoreman neighborhoods, places like Red Hook, Columbia Street Waterfront, Sunset Park, Hell's Kitchen, a lot of that disappears, and a lot of the cultural institutions that surrounded that industry start to disappear.
I mean, Red Hook really just took the brunt of these changes.
The neighborhood is sort of decimated, jobs just sort of fall away. Unionized folks are sort of bought out, so they still have an income, but they're not working anymore. So there are a lot of folks just sitting around doing nothing.
The BQE, which was built to carry automobile and truck traffic, it just really cut through the neighborhood. It displaced so many people, and the neighborhood was just kind of never the same afterwards. So what happened over time is that, you had a small population of people, drastically reduced from Red Hook at its heyday, who lived primarily in public housing, who could not afford to move, who no longer had these walk-to-work jobs available to them, and you had a neighborhood mired in poverty. Now, decades later, there's a kind of a school of thought among sociologists that urban poverty was caused in large part by the loss of urban manufacturing. So when we arrive in the 1970s, there's a whole host of social and economic problems that are colliding, particularly in low-income communities of color like Red Hook. The city had this tendency to kind of put people and uses that it didn't care for on the waterfront. And I know that seems surprising today because we think of the Brooklyn waterfront and the New York waterfront as like some of the most valuable real estate in the city. But if you could go back in time and take a walk around Red Hook in the 1970s, you would find public housing that was falling apart, urban poverty writ large, waste transfer stations, sludge stations, a lot of very polluting uses that the city tended to cluster, as a kind of environmental injustice in low-income communities of color across the 5 boroughs. And you would see a lot of formerly active industrial businesses that had basically been abandoned.
To come to Red Hook after its incredible, profound collapse of the 1970s and 80s, you can't imagine this place was ever an economic powerhouse. And that actually not only was it economically powerful, there was an incredible amount of industrial invention going on here. It was teeming with life, jammed with people, multiple, not just ethnicities, people from all over the world, because they would come off of ships either as immigrants or as crew. It's a completely different place.
You have this phenomenon of white flight, and I think most accounts of New York City's financial decline tend to focus on, the people, the individual people, the families who were fleeing the city for the suburbs. But it wasn't just people. It was companies, legacy firms who had operated in New York City for 150 years. They picked up, overnight, and they went to New Jersey. Or they went even farther afield, right? Because New York City has never been a very hospitable climate for businesses. It is expensive to do business here. There's not a lot of land. There was rising crime. You know, the city has never been very good at investing in its industrial areas. And if you look at these reports that they submit to the city, year after year, it's the same complaints, right? There's not enough sanitation. There's no enforcement of dumping. There's very poor lighting, right? And all of that, you know, it creates a poor social atmosphere, but it also creates a poor business atmosphere. And so for various reasons, many businesses just kind of fled.
But you have this interesting confluence of events that also happens in the 1970s and 80s. So the piers are being abandoned at this time. This is at the same time that we have the passage of the Clean Water Act. And this is great. This is a landmark piece of legislation that has vastly improved the health and lives of Americans all across the country. And it has vastly improved the water quality of our harbor. And so we have all sorts of marine life we haven't seen in generations that are here now in New York Harbor. But another creature has come back that we're not as excited about as whales and dolphins and seals, and that is marine borer worms, or shipworms. And so you start to see this infestation take over in the 70s and 80s, and it still continues today. A lot of the infrastructure that we built was made out of wood because they didn't really worry about shipworms because the harbor was so dirty. They never expected the harbor to get any cleaner, and wood was cheap and readily available. And so what happens is at the same time these facilities are being abandoned, they're getting overrun by shipworms, and so that just accelerates their deterioration. So we see a very, very rapid just disintegration of this pier infrastructure. And so that's why the waterfront really looks so bad, like in the 80s and 90s. It's not just because it was abandoned, it's because there's literally these little creatures that are eating it from the inside out.
So the piers are sitting and they're uplands, and the uplands being the shoreline of the piers. So they're sitting and they're underutilized. You know, they're used as storage warehouses or car parking lots, if you will. That's sort of what you found on the uplands of Pier 5 and Pier 6. So they essentially start to become a drain on the Port Authority's balance sheet. And so the Port Authority starts to think about, well, what are we going to do with these assets that are not only underperforming in an economic sense, they're also deteriorating because each of these piers are held up by like 3,000 to 5,000 wood piles.
And in a city where real estate is so prime, it's kind of fascinating that so much was left to rot. But some people have speculated, and I can't disagree with them now, that the rot here was maybe deliberate, that they were just holding this for the day that they could just suddenly make a whole new condo city.
In terms of New York City as a whole, you see the city moving toward what's called a fire economy in the early 90s. Finance, insurance, real estate.
And what we've seen is huge swaths of our waterfront, especially here in Brooklyn, rezoned for commercial and primarily luxury residential development. It's interesting to see how our relationship with the water has changed pretty dramatically, like in the span of about 30 years. Go back to the early 90s, no one wanted to live on the Brooklyn waterfront. I think the first official industrial waterfront development was built in Astoria. That was in the mid 80s, and that was who would want to live there. So it's all been a very, very recent phenomenon that people actually want to live on the water. The people that used to live on the water were people who couldn't afford to live anyplace better. The waterfront was dangerous.
When I first showed up, 1997, there was still illegal dumping of cars and trucks. That there wasn't as much dumping of bodies, but it really reached that level.
Red Hook had a pack of wild dogs that lived in the Todd shipyards.
The water was disgusting. No one wanted to live in those areas, and now it's completely flipped.
If you're looking in, 1980, 1990, you just couldn't get down here to the water. And I think now in 2025, people just can't even imagine what it would be like to not have access to this waterfront.
But there's a big difference between being on the water and being in the water. A lot of our waterfront that has been redeveloped as parkland, okay, that's based on passive rather than active recreation. And it is not designed with maritime or water-dependent uses in mind.
Having a public park that's accessible to everyone, that's on the waterfront, for most parts of New York City, that is a new thing. What we've lost, though, is the informal ways that people access the water in the past. So again, for working class New Yorkers, swimming in the East River was a regular part of, daily life in the summertime. There were lots of places where people could have this informal access. Again, not super safe, not officially recognized, but it's something that you could do. And instead, we have a much more regulated, much more supervised, much more sanitized waterfront. And, for most people, that's fine. For a lot of people, it's not great, right? So it's created, by creating more spaces of more accessible spaces, it does, for some people create like areas of exclusion. Take, for example, queer people on the waterfront. The waterfront was a key space for a lot of queer life and queer culture because it wasn't supervised, right? So it's places that people could gather and be themselves, and a much more accepting environment. And a lot of those spaces have been erased, right, because of this.
In quite a number of cases, the community there had a space that they had created and more access to it. So when the quote-unquote improvement of the new park comes, what has actually happened in this city is it's attached to luxury residential development. And so then two things happen, or probably more, but for now let's talk about two, is that community is usually gentrified out. So the improvement, they're not benefiting from that improvement. But secondly, these parks are just like incredibly detailed in their design. And so you can't just, it's not like you can sort of saunter in and do the whatever that would happen before, that there's like no barbecuing, or barbecuing happens here if you're lucky to have a park with barbecuing. You need a permit to do something. So you can't suddenly have, some sort of reggaeton concert on a Saturday night because the neighborhood feels like doing it. It's very different. It's a very physically programmed and administratively programmed space. It's a very different experience.
You can play basketball, you can play tennis, you can sit on a bench, you can ride a bike, you can ride a skateboard. I can go on and on with all the competing uses of everybody that wants to use that waterfront. But one of the things you probably can't do is find a pier to go get on a boat to enjoy a historic ship. We've kind of missed the boat often. The most popular historic use now is a beer garden, oyster bar.
Waterfront access is broader, but it's much more supervised and surveilled and sanitized. And the key point there being, you can't go in the water, in most places. So your access to the water is very much mediated like through the state or through these private developers. And that mediation almost never includes actually getting in the water. But I don't think access is the only value or the only goal. And when we talk about zoning in general, it's about mediating or reducing friction and conflict between incompatible uses, which you're always going to have with any land use. And so if there are certain uses we want to have for land, we want to ensure that we're not inserting incompatible uses. It's especially important when we talk about industrial space, because a luxury condo is always going to generate more money and pay more rent than an industrial tenant. It's just a fact of the matter. So if we want to just have luxury condos, we can do that. But if we want to still retain industrial jobs, we need to make space for those types of uses that aren't going to run into conflict. People complain about this all the time. They're like, why isn't there a park at the Brooklyn Navy Yard? I'm like, well, because we still use the waterfront. We can't have people wandering around the shipyard. We still want to maintain this vital infrastructure and these jobs. You know, if you throw out a piece of garbage, if you put gas in your car, frankly, if you go to the bathroom in New York City, that stuff at some point was on a barge pushed by a tugboat, and there's a good chance that it was repaired here at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And this is part of the second busiest port in the United States. You can't have public access to every single inch of the waterfront because, again, it's going to create conflict, and it's going to, in that battle, industry is going to lose every single time.
New York City's plan to redevelop Red Hook's waterfront sparks debate.
Last spring, the mayor and governor announced ownership of the historic Brooklyn Marine Terminal will be transferred from the Port Authority to the city's Economic Development Corporation.
But some are calling this process a sham to push luxury real estate development. Hannah Klieger explains from Red Hook.
With the mayor's big announcement last May came a promise to redevelop this 122-acre plot of land into a thriving maritime port focused on freight loads coming into the city. Leaders said the land transfer of Brooklyn's last active cargo port would reduce truck traffic and create a harbor of the future. But late last year, the New York City Economic Development Corporation announced a proposal to bring thousands of mostly market-rate housing units to parts of the site as a way to pay for the port upgrades.
So the Brooklyn Marine Terminal is a really interesting case.
The city is taking over this stretch of Port Authority waterfront, all the way from Brooklyn Bridge Park south to the end of the Brooklyn Cruise Terminal, which goes deep into Red Hook.
The BNT, we always knew, like developers have been dying for this land, like for years. Like I remember in 2018 when Cuomo, before he had to resign from office, he was mentioning this in the state of the state.
What the city is proposing is not keeping it all in maritime industrial use. If that's the case, you have to rezone it. One of the crux of the issues here is, well, for the maritime industrial advocates, we're like, no, there shouldn't be housing here at all. We should just proceed.
And initially they went out and told the community, well, how would you like a new modern port and parks? And wouldn't that be beautiful? And the community says, well, that doesn't sound bad. And then slowly they began mentioning, well, then there's housing, and a lot of housing, 9,000 units, 13,000 units. And then the community sort of got increasingly alarmed and upset and started to organize.
And, I'm encouraged that they do still want to keep, a waterfront port facility there. But again, it comes down to incompatible uses. So if you're going to have some luxury marina over there, is that going to interfere with the operation of the port? And there's always tension in New York City because we need more housing as well. But is this actually going to produce housing for people who need it? That's the big question mark. I think it really comes down to the details. Are you going to create true community space there that's accessible? Are you going to allow space for the existing waterfront users? That doesn't just include the port, that also includes cultural sites, where is PortSide NewYork going to go, the Mary Wayland. So there's still a lot of question marks, and I think the process has just been going really, really fast.
And what's really important here, because it gets into the YIMBY, this is not that situation. This is the last working waterfront, and we need these working waterfronts. We really, really, really do. They say there's a housing crisis. Okay, granted. First of all, I think it's an affordable housing crisis, not just a housing crisis, but granted. But we have a maritime crisis too. This is the last working one. And if we get rid of all the working waterfronts, where are we going to park ships? You can't park ships in Canarsie and Bed-Stuy and Bushwick, nowhere. This is where ships go. So we need to preserve that. The EDC has this cookie cutter approach everywhere they go. They just, the same plan almost, a beautiful esplanade and then, build some ridiculous housing.
But I have never, in my 28 years now of obsessing on New York City's waterfront, ever seen a situation where the community is presented with we make this less industrial and you get parks and new housing and community amenities and whatever, and people demand a port. And that is overwhelmingly what's happening.
There's a very pragmatic, very reasonable neighborhood. We have no attachment. I have no attachment. I don't know any longshoremen. We're not being selfish like that. We want, those are great jobs, and we feel that the city needs that. We just need to move more stuff over the water. It's related to the climate change and everything. We need to get cars off the road. They've been trying to choke this port forever. This is the port that don't die, because they've tried to kill it. As much as they've tried to kill it, it will not die. It can thrive if they gave it the right opportunity and size. But if you start building and you choke it and you don't give it enough land, there's no way it can survive. And sometimes I think that that's their plan. To choke it to the point where it's not viable, and then 15 years later say, well, the port didn't work, let's keep building. Because that's all they seem to want to do is build. Somebody's going to get very rich here, or they hope to.
When I think about the BMT process, I think back to the public process around Brooklyn Bridge Park. The public process really taught the city a lot. It taught the city a lot about the importance of public process, about getting multiple viewpoints, about outreach, and about doing more to reach out to the community. And in many ways, I feel like EDC heard that message. But when you think about the public process for Brooklyn Bridge Park, it was 20 years, right? And the public process for the BMT project is really short of a year.
The idea that the EDC thought they were going to do their community engagement within about 4 months, that they were going to do it September until early 2025, which was maybe March 1. But they didn't have a plan yet. So what are you engaging people about what? And not that you would have a final plan, some sort of concept. So they are doing market research and studies and iterative planning while they're doing their community outreach.
But it's a very complicated process, and the EDC, which is fronting this, is not being totally above board, despite the fact that they have all these sessions telling people what they're doing. They're just dumping information on us and not really listening and not telling us the full story right up front.
Yeah, I feel like my community is getting bullied. Like, these people are just coming in with all this power and all this thing, and are just bullying the community. And we haven't got a say. Every meeting they're telling us what they're doing, and they're adding more housing, it seems. And at what point are we going to be able to put in alternate plans?
The headlines from the 1970s are, in some places, very similar to headlines you see today. Community up in arms saying, slow down. Too fast. Let's think this thing through. Maybe there's a plan to be had, but this is not it. And the government says, we got to do it now. We got to do it now.
When you think about what's happening with Piers 7 through 12 now, there are so many parallels to what was happening back in the mid-1980s with the Port Authority wanting to de-accession piers, but with some crucial differences between those two, other than site control, with EDC, having site control as opposed to both the city and the state, and the conversations being more complicated. The other key difference is that you didn't really have working waterfront in terms of ships coming into Brooklyn Bridge Park in that conversation. So you really had, almost a kind of housing, light industrial commercial development versus open space kind of conversation, which is complicated, but which is much less complicated than when you have open space, housing, and light industrial, and working port.
So the idea that Red Hook, which has been neglected for so long, now is tasked with solving multiple crises that the city feels pressure to address, housing, jobs, real estate development. I personally think that's fascinating, but it's also kind of crazy, and it shows you how contentious this one strip of land has become. In some ways, because the waterfront, ironically, right, the oldest part of our city, became a new frontier in the 90s and 2000s. Mistakes were made. There were tools we didn't have. And planning is forever, right? So once you set developers loose, if you don't have certain requirements, it's all kind of very difficult to fix later.
We live here, in this area here, we live with the mistake that was the BQE. That was 70 years ago, and we still live with it every day. And that's what we're trying to avoid here, to make a mistake that then our grandchildren have to live with. And rushing this just doesn't make sense. Like, it just doesn't make sense. It's a monumental, once-in-a-lifetime thing. And what's the purpose of rushing through it? Like, who benefits from that?
When you bring all these different stakeholders together to talk about what should happen, on the site of the Red Hook container terminal, you have a lot of different feelings, because a lot of people still feel like the identity of the neighborhood, once you disconnect that from the working waterfront, then you're just Williamsburg, right? You're not Red Hook anymore. And at the same time, people really value the kinds of improvements that have come from the departure of heavy industry. It's important that there's now an established tradition of community planning in Red Hook. It's important that Red Hook is organized.
Last week I was at a rally in City Hall, and I was coming off the Brooklyn Bridge, and I started tearing because I was on an Uber and I'm looking at the waterfront, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful, and it needs to be revitalized. But even like that, gritty and everything, it's beautiful. It represents Brooklyn. That's Brooklyn, right? I looked at it, and I said, a working waterfront with blue collar guys, union guys making good money. They make great money, right? Working, and with ships there and the backdrop of brownstones and stuff. That's Brooklyn. What's it going to look like 15, 20 years from now? And what's it going to say about us? Is it just going to be a wall of glass towers or whatever they're going to put there?
Looking at the proposals for BMT, there's one rendering for Atlantic Basin that purports that the drawing shows the celebration of maritime history for locals and visitors. And I've now dubbed that kind of landscape architect designed park or esplanade as last gen planning. And it's another one of these last gens. So there are paths and things and trees, and there's one little teeny weeny dock with one kind of sailboat over there. Our corner with the Mary Whalen is cut out, but there's nothing in there that indicates heritage or presence of maritime. They haven't even filled up the piers with boats.
As the city develops, my fear is always that we lose the aspects of Red Hook that made it so special in the first place. The historic and scenic charm. Since revolutionary times, in the 1700s, Red Hook has had shipbuilding and repair, and we no longer have that once we lost the dry dock that was at the IKEA site.
And that incredible sense of lost in time, forgotten place is really gone.
It's incredible to see these buildings and think about how quickly they were built. Industrial history is a testament to the ability that we used to have to make things, right? To make things well, to make things quickly, and to do it better than maybe anyone else in some sectors. We don't take pride in these colossal industrial buildings anymore, right? We want to show off our gleaming luxury condos. We want to show off our beautifully manicured parks. Finding a way to fit industrial buildings into that context is really challenging.
The value of making people more aware of these histories, I think, is principally to, again, get people to care about the roles that they play today and why these are valuable, irreplaceable resources, not just for their historical significance, but if a historic building can be preserved and repurposed for maybe a different industrial use, that's a big win. But people have to care, right? And oftentimes people are less familiar with the industrial zones. They're less familiar with the history of some of these areas. So again, I see history as an entry point for a lot of people, to help them, understand the significance. And it's all the better when we can continue some of those historic purposes in these buildings. So that's one of the main missions we have of our tours, is to, again, build that constituency for historic preservation, for industrial retention, and for supporting the mission of creating good quality jobs for people. But we do that by leveraging public resources and private investment. That's what the Navy Yard, that's what the Army Terminal is really all about. Because unfortunately, we've seen what happens when it's just basically rezoned and turned over entirely to private industry, is that we don't get those kinds of jobs. We get luxury housing, we get investment properties.
I think there are very few people who are working to preserve the industrial waterfront. And, it's something that needs to be seen, right? It's a story that's difficult to tell when that waterfront has changed beyond recognition, right? When all that remains are like the names of industrialists. We've lost a lot of industrial buildings, some to fire, some to redevelopment, some to just abandonment and decay. Preservation itself is not a large movement, and this is kind of like a subset.
I don't think the city should allow the destruction of a building until there's a replacement plan in place. Because what's happening then is, not only in the case here, destruction of historic buildings, but you're leaving scars on the landscape. And so what happened to Red Hook, a neighbor that's trying to and is, revitalizing itself, is that you're just left with more and more scars.
Historic preservation is a very tough fight. Out of sight, out of mind is a very powerful component. One of the easiest things to not notice is something that's not there. When you find a way to repurpose and reuse, whether it be cobblestones or old Civil War era buildings that are still around, they create a sense of community. They create a sense of space.
People in Red Hook sometimes forget are unaware of the grand history of the neighborhood and the impact it had both locally and nationally.
The socioeconomic story of the New York waterfront and the Brooklyn waterfront is the story of global and national forces bearing down on the lifeblood of these communities.
This is the largest city real estate transaction in recent history.
I mean, these global forces that have shaped the history of Red Hook, they continue, to create pressure in the neighborhood.
So I think the neighborhood's beginning to remember this stuff, and I think the whole BMT process is reminding people the value of the port, and this nonprofit is out here to remind people of the area's history and what it could be. It increasingly becomes relevant. I mean, they talk about, today they talk about the Blue Highway. Well, there was a Blue Highway back then, and you just got to figure out what was done before and get that going again, because yes, there were boats moving goods around the coast. I mean, in fact, this very vessel, the Mary A. Whalen, is an oil tanker, was in a sense part of the Blue Highway because it moved fuel from up and down Brooklyn. So these things are sort of being relearned today, and we're trying to remind people of what the area was, why the area exists at all, the foundations of the neighborhood. So perhaps it can learn from that and build on the past.
We are looking for minds and people that can solve our problems. I also tell kids that come, if it matters to you, well then hands down it matters.